Hello, hi. Welcome everyone to the eighth episode in our Everything Product series. This is going to be the third one in our user experience mini series, so to say. Thanks for joining us today. Before we begin, just a quick announcement. We have a few survey questions, and there is an Amazon voucher for you when you answer that survey in full. So don't miss it. Please stay with us throughout. Now, I would love to introduce our panelists. We have a power-packed panel today. First, let me welcome Akshay Potnis. Welcome, Akshay. Akshay heads design at MessageBird. It's an Amsterdam-based unicorn startup company. Akshay personally is located in the US, in California, and he leads, product design, visual design, brand design, and research across 15 different product verticals at MessageBird. He brings a width of experience of leading product design across well-established products. One example being Slack. He was there as director of design, and before Slack, he was at Google across multiple teams, including Gmail, Android, YouTube. He did a lot of deep hands-on interactions, visual design. He's also a coder, so he's a designer developer at heart. Loves to do both design and code, and in fact, he has also been with us at GS Lab before he moved to the US. Thanks, Akshay, for joining us today. And then we also have Onkar Chogle with us. Onkar, welcome to this episode. So Onkar is a lead designer at GS Lab, and he again brings vast experience in both coding as well as design. At the start of his career, he has worked for more than a decade in developer roles in a variety of companies, be it Tech Mahindra, Nomura, Cognizant. And then for the last 4 to 5 years, he has been delving really deep into UX work, and many of our customers have really appreciated his quite exceptional contributions in a variety of projects. Just to name a few, he has done research, design, usability testing, and across projects from a variety of domains as well, right? Telecom, healthcare, and you name it. Again, keenly interested in user psychology, and has been a developer and brings that passion of building intuitive and delightful UX products, right? So thanks Omkar for joining us. Uh, Now I want to sort of start by opening the floor to both of you as to first setting the context, right? I mean, we have sort of named this episode in a little bit of a cryptic way for maybe some people. So why don't we start maybe with you, Akshay, as to how do you look at invisible design at all, and maybe you can also weave into that what sort of brought you here, to this aspect of design.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mandar. So maybe I can start with like what got me here and then show a few examples. So mainly invisible design came from working at different jobs on a very geo scale. Like, so for example, I was working on the emerging markets team at Google for almost 2 years. And one of the teams that I worked for was YouTube for Africa, where we were trying to take YouTube and, modify it and develop it for African countries. And it wasn't as simple as just taking the YouTube app and simplifying it for those people, because these users that we're dealing with are not the normal users that we deal with on a daily basis. These are people with low income, low end phones, limited data packs, were non-English speaking, sometimes had just one phone shared amongst the entire family, used to turn off their phones at night. And through designing for this area for almost 2.5 years, I realized that product adoption actually has a deep human and cultural layer to it that is otherwise invisible to us. And thinking about that and bringing it into design is the part of like unpacking the invisible design layers of what I say. So unpacking those layers between human and product and bringing them closer to each other so that we move from a minimum viable product to a minimum lovable product. That's how like I define invisible design in my head. So if I were to, show you a few examples to demonstrate what I mean, let me quickly just start sharing my screen here. So this is an example of YouTube Kids that I worked on in 2016, where we were doing some research and we figured out that kids are getting addicted to YouTube. And this was 2016 when addiction was not a thing, right? And so we started adding some parental controls to like the screens. And all the things that we did is to, because kids are really smart, they figured out codes, they figured out how to log in and stuff. So we added multiplication as like one of the things of what parents need to do to log into the app. And they have to answer this question and then log in. And this multiplication factor changes every time. So the kids were not able to like log in and figure this thing out because it was changing all the time. Now, if we hadn't known the parents' psychology side of things or the kids' psychology side of things, we would have gone for the standard Gmail and add a password thing. But this was added just because of those different layers that were understood as a part of the research. One other example that I want to take is this is one of the roads in the United States, and what you see on the right-hand side are these small ridges, otherwise invisible to us. But if you were to speed and start dozing off while driving and you start moving into that lane, you hit these ridges and it starts making a really loud sound, which then startles whoever the driver is and they have to come back into the lane. And this has saved numerous lives, like has stopped a lot of accidents. And this is again a perfect example of what I mean by invisible design. They understood human behavior and added something that was otherwise invisible, but when the rubber hits the road, that's when it like helps and figures the process out for them. So this is where invisible design comes for me as a motivation.
Very interesting. Actually, I have a quick question on the parental control, example that you showed, right? So did you also have to sort of consider, age brackets of the children, because maybe the older ones could have cracks? So what did you do for that?
Yes. So the way this worked was like in the aim was actually for age brackets from year 2 to year 4. Like, this was a bracket that they were actually targeting. In fact, we had a small area inside the YouTube office where they used to bring kids to do research. And doing research with kids was so interesting because they don't follow the standard routine. You have to go behind them for like, how do I tell a kid to press a button? You have to just keep it in front of them and wait for them to actually do that. So these were like infant kids between the age of 2 to 4 when we started doing this. Eventually it expanded to like the more bigger brackets as the app became more popular. But that's why multiplication. So like in the age of 2 to 4, multiplication is not something that kids usually do.
True. Got it. So you briefly talked on, this experience being pivotal to you. But just to add to some color to that statement, right? What are some of the stark difference that you could see that, the way maybe you or, your peers were handling some of the projects earlier, and then what was that initial, difference that you started to pick on?
So the difference was basically starting from technical requirements and turning it the other way around. So usually all projects start with technical requirements. We always go very practical in our things. But this changed the way you start looking at a problem. Like you start looking at a problem from the lens of like, hey, no matter whether that person is an admin or like some random person who's sitting there, they are humans at the end of the day. And they have certain issues that they face. Like simple things like, I have 2 monitors. Like things like these can also affect like how people end up using products, right? And so when you start designing or like actually implementing your designs, you start bringing in that lens into picture. And what happens is people start appreciating it, right? So for when we did this, like the people who we were doing research with like felt so connected to the product that they wanted to actually use it a lot more because they felt that this understands us and this is doing something for us that makes our lives a lot more better. So I think that's the difference that I started seeing in my approach towards design also, and how people are perceiving the products that we are designing.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. I also love the term that you use, right? The minimal lovable product, right? So that's a nice way to put it. So yeah, so let me sort of throw the same question to Omkar as well, right? So, how do you look at it, and what got you kicked off or started in this area?
Yeah, so as you said, I already had interest in UX and wanted to just start working on the design part. And then when I started with my first assignment, it was a video KYC application, if I remember it correctly. And then honestly, I wasn't happy with what I did there. I mean, I thought I understood the business case correctly. I designed for it, and it was working fine, at least till the time when I was using it. But then somehow it wasn't looking like a professional application, right? So I thought, let's change something. So I tried changing color, I tried changing fonts, or the spacing between elements, and then I understood that it's not trial and error that is going to work. So there is some logic has to be there between what kind of emotions or we want to bring in into the user's mind when they see certain kind of interfaces. So from that point, actually, I delve into the discovery of these human factors, and then these invisible layers that we'll be talking about afterwards, to make the user experiences very intuitive. So again, there are a couple of examples that I would like to show, which users would be able to relate to it. Let me share my screen. Okay, so this is the example of Google Translator, right? So what it does is that once you point your camera towards any signboard, it detects which language the board is written on, and then it converts the text into the specified language, whatever language you specified, and it puts the text on the same signboard. So it's like you are reading the signboard in the language which you understand, right? So if you ask the general, people, how do you feel about this application? They will say, wow, this is what exactly I was looking for. Now, the interesting thing is, from a two-liner requirement from a stakeholder or from a small idea, how do you come back to this point where user says, this is exactly what I want to see, is something which is very interesting, right? Discovering or, unwrapping the hidden layers in user psychology. This another example is a very day-to-day life example where we have this lever towards right-hand side, where if you want to go to, turn to right-hand side, we just push the lever down. If you want to turn to left-hand side, we push the lever up. Now, why it feels so natural to us? This design is not by accident. So it actually aligns with the rotation of the steering wheel when we turn to right or left. So when you are moving towards right hand side, we will have to push this down. When you are moving towards left hand side, we'll have to push this up. So that's the reason it feels natural. So the point which I want to make here is that whatever interfaces we see in real life, right? Those are not by accident. So those are thoughtfully crafted user experiences to uncover the hidden factors that we'll be talking about afterwards. And what brought me into this is, like, obviously my love for psychology, which motivates me to dig deeper into these human factors.
Very interesting. I love that both of you sort of brought examples, not just in digital products, but also, to sort of make your point more broadly that, this type of thought process is there sometimes in plain sight. Sometimes we have to think about it a little bit, but in digital as well as in physical products. So that's very interesting. So that tells me that, it cuts across the thinking behind the design, right? Uh, so one point, Onkar, that you made was about psychology of it. So what we can sort of do is again go a little deeper into that aspect, right? And again, I'm going to request both of you to sort of delve into that. And Akshay had used sort of that term of unpacking those invisible layers, and sort of how do you go from there is a requirement, there is a business requirement, or sometimes somebody may have framed it as a technology thing, but then really when you start thinking about it, as you rightly mentioned, it's not about the technology, or it doesn't necessarily have to be the starting point, right? Because the user ultimately is the real crux of it. So how do you unpack this? How do you look at it, and how do you explain? Maybe we can start with Akshay.
Yeah. Okay, so this is where I'm going to use some slides again. Since it's a design present, talk, like slides always help. And I'm going to throw a little technical terms around. So if you have any questions, please pause me and ask questions in between. So if I go back to the definition that we set up earlier, like invisible design is a process of unpacking layers between human and products to make products that people love, so that they feel more connected to it. So let's unpack this a little bit. And to do this, I'm going to use an example. Let's take an example where we are given the requirement of adding a chat GPT like interface. AI is there right now. Let's use AI as an example. So we have to integrate chat GPT like interface into Gmail. Everyone uses Gmail. So standard way of looking at this would be, hey, let's look at chat GPT. Let's look at what features are there. Let's look at what others like them are doing. Let's define the requirements. Let's see why Gmail needs it. Define requirements, simplify it, copy certain features here and there, and probably come up with something which, again, like I'll term as like the minimum viable product. So if we were to go by that definition, we would end up somewhere like this, is that we have a box where like you can put in like a the actual prompt, and then you click on generate, and then it generates something magical, some good email for you, right? This is like what I term as the minimum viable product. Like we've followed the standard process here. Now, if we were to like follow the invisible design process here and like unpack that, what would happen? Like imagine these 5 layers that we're going to think about. The human is on top and the product is at the bottom, and there are some layers in between. So the first layer I want to unpack is the nature part. What do I mean by nature? These are things that are given to us biologically, psychologically, just by birth, right? Eyes, color, cognition, cognitive load, like factors that we don't control, we don't change over a period of time. They're just there biologically with all of us. So I'll take a few examples to explain this. So one of the examples is color, right? Now, if I were to just add a little bit of color to what we saw before, the example becomes like this, right? And suddenly it starts feeling accessible. It starts feeling a lot more easier on the eye. It starts feeling that I can use this. Small things like just adding color, because the way our brain perceives it, the way we have been used to seeing like things, the ratios at which our eyes loves to see things, all of those are built into this. And without doing anything else, this feels a lot more easier to use than what it was before, just because of adding color. Another point that I would like to make is about cognitive load. So our brain can only perceive so many things at once, and it is hardwired to take the minimal effort path in every situation as possible, so as to reserve the amount of brain cycles that are going to be there. So if we just go and give them a prompt like this and ask them to start from scratch, the cognitive load is very high, because like starting from scratch always involves a lot of thinking. But if you were to give them templates, like what happens is it gives them like a nice starting point to at least build a mental model, reduce the cognitive load, and get a start, which then makes the brain feel that it's much more easier to start than what it was with like a blank prompt in there. Another quick example that I would like to take is the VARC model. So what the VARC model is basically learning model. So each one of us has different learning styles. These have been established. Like some people learn very visually by looking at images, by looking at videos. Some people learn like through audio. They like to listen to audiobooks. Some of them like to read. So all these different styles of learnings are there, right? But when we were to go into the prompt, and if you were to tell them, hey, no matter what you can do, we're just going to ask you to type things. Like what happens is you're pushing them down a certain path. Rather, like if you see at the bottom here, it is saying typing is hard, click here to try audio. So someone can just record an audio and give a prompt and just put it in there. And suddenly it becomes a lot more easier than like typing and thinking, because saying is a lot more easier than thinking. So these are factors that come naturally to us that usually affect the way we feel about how good or bad a product is, just without anything at all layering on top. Okay. The next part of the invisible design layer is the nurture part. So there are 2 sections in the nurture part. So by nurture, what I mean is like things that are not natural to us, but we evolved over a period of time to like either get habituated to them or just pick them up as we grew. So part 1 is behavioral. So these are behaviors that we have picked up over a period of time, whether it is through like our parents growing up, like through the culture, through friends, through our travel, whatnot. It is like how we behave has been shaped over a period of time by multiple different factors. And trust me, it does affect like the way like people end up using different products. I'll give you like a few examples here also. Example number 1 is fear of unknown. Everybody has a fear of unknown. Imagine like going to a new country altogether at night. Like you're fearful because you don't know what's going to happen. Or you just like are joining a new company and starting a new job. There is a sense of fear in your mind because you don't know what to expect. The same could be said of this example, right? If we were to give them a blank box and just ask them to start from scratch, specifically AI, which is something that people are already fearful of, that it's going to come and take our jobs, and hey, I don't know whether we'll have jobs and etc. and all of that. There's a lot of fear of unknown. So then what we start doing is we start reducing that fear by giving them good starting points. So here on top, you see that it is telling me like, help me phrase it, make it longer, give me an alternative. So rather than like asking them to start from scratch and think of everything, we're giving them ways to like go through that fear of unknown by giving them certain things that they already know, right? Or you start typing at the bottom, you write create a, and then it knows that you are doing an email. So it is saying create a discount offer, create a campaign, create a pop-up, show more ideas. By doing this, we are reducing that fear of unknown, which is a very common behavioral trait with every zero screen that any application has, specifically when you're adopting new users, right? Or the second one that I'll call here is the altruism connection. So what do I mean by that is, as humans, we always tend to feel good when we help out someone, right? Or somebody helps us out. We tend to feel more connected to that. Now, AI by nature is this system that is like disconnected from us, that is trying to take over something, take our jobs and whatnot. So simple things like at the bottom, you see, we've added, how did we do help us get better? By just giving a way for humans to then like contribute to the system, the people start feeling that, hey, this is not a system that is coming to take over my job. In fact, it is asking my help to get better. I can actually give it some help to get better, and it is helping me get better. And suddenly that layer of thing in between, which was, hey, the system versus human, starts getting reduced, because now both are actually helping each other be more successful and helping each other out. So an altruism connection is a very common human behavior that always helps when you want to bring the system and human more closer to each other. Okay. Now, last part, and then I'll stop with my monologue here, is the cultural layer. Now, now we saw behavioral is intrinsic to us. Like cultural layer is what I'll say is much more bigger, which is like how geographical, placements, countries, histories, everything also affect the way people use products, right? So one example that I'll give here before I go to the actual visuals is, when we were dealing with AI, like we were at MessageBird, we were like, one of the early adopters of generative AI, and we started doing some research and figured out that there was a stark difference in how different geographies, looked at AI. We went to Europe and they were so skeptical. They were like, no, not at all. Like it is going to take our data, GDPR, like we're not going to give it anything, a very closed system. And unless there are rules and moderations in place, we are not going to allow systems like these to exist inside our software, where like we don't have any control over the privacy and the amount of data that this might have access to. Now you go from there to the US, and you see something in between, in the more like advanced areas like the Bay Area or New York and Seattle. You see these early adopter ecosystems rising up where people are okay trying these technologies out, but whenever it comes to using it in their daily life, they would be like, no, I have a real job. If this goes and does something and my job comes in question, I don't know whether I'll be able to even define why certain things have happened. And then you come to India and everyone wants this, like lovely adoption. Like people like, give me more features. I want to try more things. Like this is so nice, magical, right? Zero concerns about privacy and data and like, thinking about, what will happen with that. Now these, like because of these factors, it eventually affects the way like we have to design something for all these three geographies altogether. So so one example that I'll give here is, rather than just starting from scratch, like what we help them understand is like, how will this actually help you? Like it can reduce your cold starts, it can help you get creative, it can reduce your redundant tasks, it can help you learn about the product. So having some knowledge, building a mental model of how this system will help you no matter where you're located at, suddenly starts creating an understanding of what matters to me and how this will actually help me out in my daily life. Another way is like choosing comfort level. This is basically placing the user in control and asking them, how comfortable are you with AI? And we will suggest the right amount of things. So if you choose strict mode, I am very uncomfortable, basically, then we'll keep the system as less magical as possible. We'll show you everything, every point in time, everything that's generated, everything that is created, what data is being used, we'll show it. We'll increase the number of clicks, we'll increase the number of steps, but you will feel that you are in control. But if you go down to the pro mode, which is like the magical mode, you click a magic button and it just generates, and like nothing needs to happen in between. So suddenly, because of this, no matter which geography we were doing this in, people in India were mostly choosing pro mode, and people in Europe were going for a stricter mode, and they just felt more comfortable at least trying out the system than just rejecting it right up front. Lastly, language. Very, very easy to just understand. The language connection is always there. Like if I go to some place in India, somebody who actually like feels more comfortable just saying it in Hindi or Marathi or whatever local language they're in, will obviously feel more comfortable doing it than like doing it in English. Because even though English is like a language everywhere, sometimes we just can't express certain things in like English. Like it has to come naturally from the language we care about, right? So adding like a switch language or trying different languages out also talks about how to like reduce that cultural gap in products that are there. So like we went from like a minimum viable product, and then we looked at all these different layers and eventually ended up with this. Now the right hand side is not something that will show directly. Like all these things will not show up as like a big thing. They'll show up whenever those things in the user flow make sense. But essentially you see how we went from this to like just adding these layers on top and coming up with something that eventually would work out for different people. This is like the unpacking the invisible layer. So you go from the human to the product and try to bring in lenses of the human nature, human behavior, and human culture to see how your product is going to actually be affected by it, and then try to at least minimize as much as you can. Nobody can do everything. Sometimes like requirements come in so fast that you have to do it in 2 days. It does not mean that you can't give it 2 seconds of thought. Like something is better than nothing in this case is what I feel. Like even if you give like a 2 second of thought to maybe behavioral or cultural or nature, you will be designing something that is a lot more closer to your user than what would be just by going the minimum viable path. All right, let's stop.
Yeah, this is very useful, framework, so to say, right? So I just had a quick question. So when you sort of think about it, it may happen, right, that some of those layers may jump out at you and you may think of those layers quickly, naturally first. But do you then sort of try to see, okay, if I have thought of this behavioral thing, is it based in something fundamental in our psyche as humans? Do you sort of, I mean, just for the fun of it, or even as a designer thinking about the product design, do you sort of try to mentally, traverse those layers and sort of make sure that you're covering within your given time as many bases as possible?
Yeah, so I think like because these are things that we've learned over a period of time, I think it has become very fundamental in my brain to think of this very naturally, then like go through this process. But every time we have a new designer that joins the team or comes and works with us, like this is like a standard format to follow. Like no matter what you're designing, like when you're designing it, let's say whether I'm starting from scratch or I already have a design that is existing, just before giving that design to maybe my developer, like I'll just go through this checklist of things. Like, are there things that are more fundamental? So let's say for AI, the cultural factor was very important than the other ones to think about first. So you have to decide which one makes sense for you. You don't need to go through all of them. Like, but what is more fundamental to, let's say, what you're releasing right now, what you're doing today? So for us, the first big thing of AI was like in general adoption. Like people were skeptical about it. So let's try to minimize that gap first. And so once I had a design, like you just go through the cultural layer and have a little bit of iterations on next to it. And usually how I end up doing it is I present everything. So here is minimum viable and here is minimum lovable. And then because usually when you go to developers, like because I was a developer myself, they like to under promise and over deliver. So you give them options. So you give them the minimum viable one, so they feel okay, we have a minimum viable one if needed. But then they usually end up developing the minimum lovable one because they eventually figure out a way to bring it together. And if you involve them in the process, it's even more better because they feel like they're not just people who are executing things for you, but were a part of establishing the product. And so this process eventually helps bring the teams also closer to each other.
Yeah, I think this is going to be immensely useful to practitioners, both I'm guessing both for developers who have sort of a bend of mind towards design as well as, designers, because I think, and you have in the true sense of the word sort of, unpacked, that process, which to an outsider like myself, say it may seem little mystic, mysterious, right? So now I want to sort of, come to Omkar and again, ask him sort of a broad question. How does he look at, that thought process? What you try to tease out, and I'm sure you have, because of your unique experience, you may have your own way of looking at it, right? So I'm quite curious to see what you think of it.
Yeah, so true. So that was a nice example which Akshay gave, right? It's about the latest technology that we use and how we went from the basic model to the lovable product. Now, for me, at every stage of the product design or UX design, I would say, we will have to understand at which stage, which factors to consider and up to which level. Okay. So maybe I'll talk about the UX process, and in that UX process, how we amount for the human factors. Okay, so obviously we start with the context. So when we start with the context, it's important for us to know what is the problem that we are solving, right? Let's not get into the user interface directly, because ultimately the user interface is something which is going to impact your context. In this example, if you say the context is writing an email, okay, and in that email writing, this is the interface which we are bringing in, which is going to add value to my email writing as a whole context. So when we understand the context, the rest of the processes falls in line. Be it what are the tasks we need to identify, or be it what are the human factors we need to consider, right? Because there are a lot of human factors in psychology that you will find, and which exactly you will use at which point of time. So the context helps us to fit in everything together and pick and choose what exactly is useful for us. So once we understand the context, we go in and actually research about users. So when we say research about user, what we do is we talk to them. And when we talk to them, it's important to show empathy to them. We are not here to judge them. Okay, so we need to understand what they are doing. We need to understand what their mental model. So basically, mental model is something like what is our perspective of how things should work, right? So if there is a switch, you would assume that if you move it up, the volume would increase. If you move it down, the volume will decrease. So this is what the mental model is. So we'll have to understand what is the mental model of the user for that particular context. What is their social, cultural, and educational background? What are their motivations? What are the fears? What are the challenges? The challenges can be physical challenges or psychological challenges which we have. And when we, sort of understand this information related to user in context of what we are designing, let us say email writing, then we will understand what is the thing which is of more important to us. Like Akshay explained, in email writing, he understood that because of the cultural background, few people might be interested in saying it in Hindi or saying it in Marathi. So this is the cultural background, as he said. In certain cases, we first identify, because that is the major differentiating factor between the users across the world. Once we identify the users, it's also important to simplify the user flows for the further application building. So I'll quickly show you guys one image. Okay, so this you can see. I am not sure whether we have shared. Let me just share it. Okay, so this, as you can see, it is an overall scope of whatever we can think about from a product perspective. So the blue circle talks about business requirement, and this orange circle talks about the human factors. And somewhere, obviously, we have to consider all the business requirement to satisfy the product, but then there are some human factors that are must. So as you can, if you just split this image, you will see that the left hand side circle, which says must do, is something which we have to consider while creating a product. And this left hand side portion, which contains the larger human factors that we might not have considered in actual product design, are those things which, if we consider, creates a wow factor. Okay, so without which the product will not fail. But then if you want to improve on the product, then these are the things that you need to consider. Okay, so once we identified the set of use cases or user flows that we need to identify, the next step becomes to simplify them. So when we say simplify, the thing which comes to our mind is, okay, simplifying means reducing. Okay, so it's not actually reducing the steps, as we have seen in Akshay's case, right? For the European customers, or for the other customers, what he actually did is he increased couple of screens in between to help them understand the application, give them control, give them power. So when we help user with the simplified flow, it actually gives them power. So not exactly reducing the steps, but then modifying the steps based on user context, removing the redundant steps, or making it less confusing, not allowing user or making user to make unnecessary decisions. We can use some defaults. You can guide them with some examples. So again, in case of the Akshay's example, we saw that he, if you remember, he allowed users to uh, talk instead of writing. Okay, so that is what simplified interface talks about. So user can simply talk about it, and then the prompts will appear, and then the software will work. In case of Google Translator, if you see the normal flow, if I'm not using a Google Translator, I'll walk up to the board, I'll read the board, and I'll understand. Now, Google Translator does not change anything in that flow. It is just that it comes, it brings a camera in between you and the board. Everything remains same. Even the text, it is written on the board itself. So this is how simplifying user flow is. Then after we get to simplified user flows, then how to convert those in UI elements, right? So when we talk about UI elements, every elements talk to us. So, when we see a button on screen, we know that it's clickable. When you see a text box, it is, you can click in it and you can write something inside it. So that's the reason we need to always use the recognizable element so that user, does not fall into any confusion. And to augment with UI elements, what we use is micro interactions. So micro interactions is like the hover effect or the focus or changing of cursor from pointer to hand, or having that small spinner when something is working in background. So these are the factors which augment with your existing UI elements and provide wow factor to your user experience as a whole. Again, when we talk about the UI elements, we need to create a unique mood for application. For example, if you remember what Akshay did is he used purple color in his application, right? So purple represents creativity, magic, and that's the reason it sets up a mood for this application. And it is important to keep this mood consistent with the context that we have identified. And again, keep this consistent across complete application. Once we have this, we kind of done with most of the stuff. And what remains is handling the exceptional cases. So for example, there might be some error because of the application is failing. So in that case, we need to, tell user what has happened and what user needs to do next. So if you just say something has happened and we are not able to process your request, so this is not sufficient for user. You might say, try again after some time. So this tells user, okay, if I try again, I might succeed. So this is important. And in cases where you anticipate that user might fail somewhere, then we need to be compassionate with users. We need to forgive users, maybe in terms of providing autosave, or maybe providing undo operation, as you might have seen in the Gmail, right? You send an email, it sends an email and then gives you option to undo in case you remember that, okay, I forgot to write something in subject or something of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
So also error handling considers the flexibility of input. As you might have seen in Akshay's case, he doesn't expect you to type everything to give them the output, right? If you type something, the application might suggest you some pills, or if you even type few keywords and say generate, it will still generate, out of those keywords, some things, but on which user can build up. So this is how we need to be, compassionate with users so that that will not be a burden for user to use this application. And at the end of it, it is very important to test this application with real users. So real users, and I would say better motivated users. So real motivated users will give you the correct feedback for your application, and then you can utilize this feedback for your iteration. So in software industry, right, option to iterate over whatever you have designed is actually a boon for us, right? In other industries, it's not that much possible. Consider a surgeon which says, okay, we need to perform heart surgery, but we will do some MVP this week, and then if you feel better, we will iterate over it, right? So this is not possible in other industries. So let's use this option to iterate as opportunity to build better applications. So in conclusion, we can see that we went through all this aspect of UX design, like context, understanding the context, identifying the user elements, using those in simplifying task flows, using those in choosing UI elements, using those in handling errors, and then finally testing and iterate. So at the end, as Akshay said, it is not compulsory to use everything everywhere. If you have seen this overlap, there is some overlap which is important, right? The more you overlap, the more human factors you will consider and the more wow factor you will create with your application. But it is obviously not compulsory to consider everything. Obviously, the time and money will not allow you to do that. But then even if you start with something and if you see the value of it, then you will be motivated to do better. And as Akshay said, exactly, even if you consider a few of the human factors in your design, you will see the considerable enhancement in what you did before that iteration.
Yeah, I think quite useful, for you. Thanks for, elaborating on that process, and also very interesting layers also in that. And I think we're going to have probably a second follow-on conversation, much more into the process of it. But I have one question and for both of you. So both of you sort of hinted at, having that empathy for the user, starting with the user, understanding their psyche. So I have sort of a two-part question, right? So one is, on one hand, there may be some things which are possible in technology, but which will become a distraction for the user while using it. So as an engineer, maybe I may have fun, developing that little thing, but as a smart designer, that's good. So have you seen that? And on the other hand, have you seen things that you couldn't do, but sort of the user may have wanted, but sort of then technology comes in the way, right? It's either not possible or it makes very complicated. So on one hand, it's possible to do, but it's distracting, it's actually not helping the product. And on the other hand, it would have been cool to do, but sort of can't really do it right now because in some way it's technologically so have you seen examples like this, or would love to get both of your takes on it?
Yes, maybe I can go first. I'll take the same example that I gave before. So, what was technically possible there is to have just one generate button placed inside of the email editor, and it just generates the email for you, right? It is technically possible. Lovely technology behind the scenes. Like, our engineers would have probably figured out how to do it in 2 seconds, just get it out there, and it like I'm writing an email and the prompt just gets magically replaced by something different by using what's there. It's very, very magical. It is possible to do. But again, like, if we consider those factors that we're considering, this is something that scared everyone. Is like, if I were to write a business email and if I were to not proofread it and this were to go to, let's say, my boss, now, oh my God, like, and even more when it goes to your client, even more when you're doing a deal, like the layers just go on increasing. And Gmail, even though it is a email writing product, it is writing emails for a very specific purposes that affect how the company works, like how much money you make, how many deals you crack, how relations you have with your peers, and all of that. So as like the designers in the team, we said, no, we're not going to do this. Like, nothing is going to be magical. So we came up with certain principles. So one of the principles was, nothing magical happens without the user input. Every time something gets generated, we show it in a separate window, let the user see it, keep on generating again until they feel confident about what they want, edit it. And even once they edit it, we ask them like, hey, we are noticing these discrepancies in like what we are seeing everywhere else, and then go ahead and submit it. So increasing number of steps happened there, but like, we did stop the technology from being used as is. Now there might be other scenarios where the technology is awesome. Image generation, right? You go into like, if you're creating a slide deck and you want an image to be generated, it's okay, like, to magically generate things. So contextually the technology was there, but we ended up using it in different place rather than ending it in like the Gmail or the mail creation example that I was giving. To the other side, where we had something I did not like, the language one, which I showed. Language is always very hard. NLP is hard to do. Like, there's a reason why you don't see the language thing in like multiple different areas, because no one except Google has found a way to crack NLP in general in the most, less error prone way as possible, right? And so that was something that was a nice and good to have, but couldn't be in the part of the MVPs or the MLPs that you were designing for, because there are other things that were more important than that. Language became like a tertiary factor. Good to have, but is it more important than the cultural factor of people feeling safe adopting it? No, it's not. So then that gets on the lower, but that does not mean we don't design it. Like, one example that I'll give is like, what happened in all of this is we spent just 2 days on like iterations, but we involved the developers, we involved PMs, everybody was here. So when we did this entire exercise, we knew what the possibilities could be, and then came down to what is going to be done, right? So everybody was on the same page. There was no miscommunication, misunderstanding between different stakeholders that were there together. And whenever the developers after that noticed certain areas where we could start bringing in certain things that were iterated at that point in time, they came and said, hey, Akshay, like, I can see that, this could be useful in here. Why don't we go and do that? They felt that, they are equal contributors to the product in a way, and not just like people who are executing things. So I think just this process has like a multi-layer effect on not just developing the right things, but also bringing in different stakeholders to then feel more connected to what they are building.
Beautiful. I think this makes the the development experience itself joyful, right? I mean, you're doing a delightful product for your end customers, but also for the team, both the designers as well as developers. I think you brought out that point quite well. Thanks for that. Yeah, Omkar, would love for you to weigh in.
Yeah, so we as well make it a point that whenever we give a handoff of a design to our developers, we do explain them why we are designing it that way. Okay, so that when they are developing, they understand the meaning of it, they understand the impact that the design is going to create on the end user, so that there is an acceptance to the design, and then they try their best to implement the way we are designing it. But then there are situations where we need to understand certain technical constraints as well, right? So in the past we have observed that I mean, being a developer, I understand those constraints very quickly, but as a pure designer might not understand that. One of the example is we had to populate this table, and I suggested let's have a pagination there. It was a B2B application, and then even my lead designer who was there, he was also fine with that pagination. And then certainly developer said we cannot implement pagination. We said, why can't you implement the pagination? Because they said it's not possible to bring certain amount of data like 20 pages, 30 pages, and the next 30 pages. So the lead designer which we had at that time at client side could not understand why it is not possible. But then I went to the developers and I asked, "Okay, what is the problem? Why are you not able to just create certain pieces of the 100 records and just get 10 records in one go?" So they said we are using DynamoDB. So because of the performance thing, they are using DynamoDB, and then DynamoDB does not return a fixed set of numbers. It returns the amount of data which is possible in certain size. Let us say 30 KB or 40 KB or 100 KB, something of that sort. So it is also important to understand the technical constraints, because at the end of the day, if your design doesn't see light of the day, it is of no use, right? So we have to understand, and we have to make certain compromises on that. So what we did is we added a button at the bottom which says load more. So whatever records the table could get, we displayed those, and then we said load more. Even we were thinking about having that in scroll, right? That would have been a great user experience. But then if user accidentally scrolls and if we get more data, the data comes from AWS, and then we have to pay for every data that comes from AWS. So we have to consider the stakeholder requirements as well, stakeholder constraints as well. And it is really nice to work within constraints. That gives you more ability to think about it, find more solutions to it, think out of the box and find some solutions. So yeah, we need to make some decisions, but then those are informed decisions, and those help us build our knowledge better.
I think
Yeah, so I love that perspective where both of you have brought out how they work together, and not just designer developers working together, but also considering aspects which seemingly go way beyond how design is looked at typically. So I'm sure those of the practitioners who are sort of listening in, or if there are developers with an inclination to design, if they are listening, I'm sure this is very illuminating for them. Thanks for elaborating on that. So we are in the last about 10 odd minutes. So what I would love to do is maybe for both of you to sort of throw a light on the top one or two myths that you typically see, right? Some misconceptions that you typically see, and maybe we can again go to Akshay and then Omkar, that you would want to sort of speak on and sort of demystify those and get those cleared up.
Yes, for sure. So I'll take the top two from a very organizational perspective that I see. One is, hey, we work in service. It's not like product. We just give what the client asks because we work on very stricter timelines. A very common term that I see whenever I've worked with like the service type of design that is there, right? And I think it's good to understand a much more wider perspective to this. One is service and product are not as separated as they used to be in the earlier days. Like our entire industry has reached a point of stagnation where we're not developing anything net new. We are just finding ways to combine things that existed previously, or just develop something better, very contextual to like the problem that comes to us. So because of that, like the service and product have started coming more closer to each other. Hirings have been started like that. Like in fact, like a lot of the hirings that I see today are people from product actually being hired in service and people from service being hired in product, just to bring those things together, because there's nothing net new that is being developed. A layer on top of that is, if you see at a company level, like initially enterprise or service deals used to be these long-term deals over the 10 years, or like you develop something for someone, whether it's like as a service, or like you develop something for like 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Those things have reduced now. Like people have started doing much more shorter deals and shorter timelines, because they want to keep on moving. Technology is moving at a much higher pace. People are adopting things at a much higher pace. And because of that, customization has become prime. And when customization in prime, the word customization also means, personalizing something to the effect of someone's usage, right? Which means you need to understand the human, which eventually brings up design into picture. So the we work in service and not in product sentence does not apply anymore, because the industry has moved on, people have moved on. But if you still keep applying that lens, what will happen is you'll end up developing things that look 10 years old, and people will not be happy with that, because what they're seeing out in like the world and what is being developed has like a very big huge difference. So from that perspective, I think as technologists who are building these things, we need to move on from that thinking and get towards the much more, product and service are very similar to each other in development, even though they might not be in usage. The second myth is, how does design justify impact? Like design, like very hard to take design and apply it to monetization. Very hard to just find that relation, because design works at a much more earlier level, and like what goes out there and creates the monetization impact is very different. So people usually say building and shipping justifies impact. What about design? Like, let me tell you like a few things of why design could be, why that myth is a myth, right? So these things are the things that I've observed from my last 5-6 years of design-oriented development. Like, one is customer retention. You build something really good that looks good and feels good, like your customers are ought to come back to you because they see a difference between what you are doing and what others are doing. A very stark difference between like the end result that they get from you within the same amount of time, even though it might contain 1 or 2 features less. Like the customers feel a lot more better, because psychologically they feel, hey, this was so much well designed, even though it might not have all the fancy features that we wanted from them, because they see it being used. The second part is the user retention part. If something is well designed and you do it for the customer, they'll see a change in their users and the way they are actually using it. They get good feedback. You go to Play Store, go to like comments on the Play Store, or like go to Stack Overflow, go to all these different product marketplaces, and you'll see well-designed apps usually have really good comments that say, I love this app, but would love to have this feature. But on the other things, you'll say, I hate this app, even this feature sucks, even though the app is really, really great, right? And so there's user retention. Then there are 3 other layers, which are which are more of internal to the company. One is when you have this process, building becomes very satisfying and fun, right? I'm not really, developers are not trying to do big off and complexity and try to get the fastest data possible, and I'm trying to write code that just works great. Yes, that is good, but that's very transactional in nature, right? If you want the developers and the other people to also relate to what is being built into like a product ecosystem, you need to bring them closer to those things. And the more closer this process gets you, the more connected the team feels in like doing something that is more useful to all of them, rather than just being like different parts that are executing in their roles. All these 2 things lead to employee growth and employee retention. By doing this, you are training others to also start thinking in very different ways. I learn how to do things better because developer is closer to me from the coding side. The developer learns to do things better from a user perspective. And now you have created 2 people which could be really effective product thinkers as they grow in their different roles. So you don't need to hire people from outside every time. Internal growth is happening intrinsically rather than extrinsically. And because of all of this, employee retention happens. Now, when they go outside, they might be like money becomes a factor up until a certain point in time. But after that, like you'll see that money is sort of the same no matter where you go. But what differentiates one company from the other is, what am I getting from this? Am I growing? Am I learning? And a process like this usually helps in employee retention. So building and shipping is just one part of it. By following processes like this, you see customer retention, user retention, satisfaction in building, employee growth, and employee retention. And these are factors that just go beyond product. It just stabilizes your company a lot more than just being people who are just building products for people.
Yeah, beautifully put. Beautifully put. Thank you so much. Yeah. I think, as you rightly said, not just the product, not just that developer plus designer working in pairs, but those ripples are felt across layers, across organization, and even beyond, because there are people who are using your product, being delighted by that. Yeah, I think that really reflects, I think, the joy that you find in what you do. I think that is also shining through. So thanks for elaborating on it. So let me come to Omkar. What myths do you come across, and would you like to shatter?
Yeah, true. So there are various things that we listen when we talk to stakeholders, right? The ideal thing, or most of the time, what happens is that we are not creating new products. So we might end up creating the product which is already there in market. One more media video player, or a chat application, or WhatsApp kind of thing, or a NMS dashboard. So things are already there in the market. So what stakeholder expects is that let's create something unique. Let's add some unique feature to it which they don't have and we have, and that's the reason users will start using our product. Now I would like to show a meme which I got a couple of days back. So no offense to coders, it happens to designers as well. So when someone asked to bring in a new feature, they blindly added some feature which they found very useful on Spotify, right?
Mhm.
So nobody is interested in shuffling episodes actually on Amazon Prime. So this is what happens when we blindly try to introduce new features to our application. However, what we should do in such cases is that we should try and get the access to human factors more. Okay, so what Akshay did, right? He did not introduce any new features per se, but what he did is, if user is typing, just try and ask user to talk. So we are not adding a new feature, but we are improving the existing features. And this is where exactly people will love your design.
Mhm.
Okay. And the another thing which we always listen specifically in B2B application is that uh, show all the data on screen, on dashboard. So user might want to see past trend, user might want to see future trends, user might want to see current data, my approvals, my pending approvals. And on top of that, they might ask for news feed as well. Some stakeholders do ask for a news feed. I'm not sure what people will do to read news feeds there. And the reason being, it's admin. So admin will process the data, because admin is used to processing huge amount of data. But what we forget is that even if it's an admin, it's a human being, right? So whatever shortcomings are applicable to human being, those are applicable to an admin as well. So that's the reason we need to consider this as a normal person, understand his limitation and design accordingly. So at this all things are possible, only when we get real users to talk to. Otherwise, we'll keep on, impersonating this, or sometimes we get this, so sometimes we call the stakeholders as though they go into God mode. Okay. So they say, okay, you want to talk to doctors, you ask me. Or we want to talk to teachers, you ask me. And with the reason, right? When they say, oh, yeah, I have talked to doctors, I know how they work and how teachers work, how senior citizen work, how even kid works, right? Because I was kid 40 years back. So, and in reality, we don't even know what is in our wife's mind, right? So that's we need to talk to actual users when we want to uncover the human factors.
Perfect. Yeah, the real world scenario, and truly bringing that in, not just bringing in some proxy, that, as you rightly said, but truly doing that last mile, and that effort, and that clearly pays off, right? Yeah, thanks so much. So maybe I'm going to come to Akshay. 1 minute. Any parting thoughts, for us on invisible design?
Yeah, parting thoughts would be no matter what kind of a stakeholder you are, I think it's not the process, but the change in mindset that I'm trying to bring in through this talk in general. Like, it doesn't matter what process you follow, how much you do, but if you just change your mindset in this way and at least give 2 seconds of thought, I think it goes a long way in making what you're building a lot more better than what it would be if it wasn't there, not just on the design level, but much more on the company level. So what I would say is, if in the next few times you build things, if you take even one thing from what we said in here, and try to build it as a part of your process, whether it's like 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, a part of your sprint. Like maybe we can talk about this as a second like webinar where like how to build it into the process and how to do all of that. That's the only parting thought I have is just if you can change your mindset to look at it this way and not just as design as something that is visual, that would be like a win-win scenario in here.
So well put, so well put. Thanks both of you for a insightful session. I really love talking to both of you. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll close it now. But yeah, please check out all these episodes on the website. They are also being posted on YouTube. Keep watching the space. In the next year, 2024, we come back to you with many more interesting such episodes, and would love to have both of you again. Thank you so much for joining. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for that much.
Thank you.
Thanks.